Hey everybody, welcome back. With this video, we're going to try to finish up Heidegger's letter on humanism. We are starting just a little bit down from where we left off with the last video. So, you can try to find it here. Heidegger writes, whoever takes communism only as a party or a Weltanschauung or worldview is thinking too shallowly. Just as those who by the term Americanism mean in a derogatory fashion nothing more than a particular lifestyle. The danger into which Europe, as it has hitherto existed, is ever more clearly forced, consists presumably in the fact, above all, that its thinking, once its glory, is falling behind the essential course of a dawning world history that nevertheless is the basic traits, in the basic traits of its essential provenance remains European by definition. I'm just going to read a little bit more. No metaphysics, whether idealistic, materialistic, or Christian, can accord with its essence, and surely not in its own attempt to explicate itself, get a hold on this destiny, and that means thoroughly to reach and gather together what, in the fullest sense of being, now is. And then he talks more about homelessness that we talked about last time. And what I wanted to get at here is that for Heidegger, a part of the problem is in the development of these various isms is that we tend to think of these as worldviews. We tend to think of them as mere perspectives, and they're like mere aesthetics, mere optics, mere positions that one can take. And Heidegger believes that this is wrong and incredibly detrimental to the task of philosophy, because it's not really taking seriously what's happening in the world. In one sense, it's not taking seriously what's happening with these movements and these traditions, and then on the other hand, it's also not really addressing, the fundamental issue for Heidegger, and that is, a break from ontology, from the question of being, the meaning of being. And so there is this idea, and he goes on here to say it, in the next paragraph. In the face of the essential homelessness of human beings, the approaching destiny of the human being reveals itself to the thought on the history of being in this, that the human being finds his way into the truth of being and set out on this find. Every nationalism is metaphysically an anthropologism, and as such, subjectivism. Nationalism is not overcome through mere internationalism, it is rather expanded and elevated thereby into a system. So it's like trying to correct the faults of the various isms, in this particular instance, nationalism, by adopting a more plural or inclusive or progressive or, liberalism like internationalism, and that is basically not sufficient. That this gets into some of what's put forward. I mean, not only in his sort of basic philosophy of being in time, but some of what is put forward in the question concerning technology. And that is that we basically, we see ourselves, we see others as part of a system, and that type of inframed approach is something that's going to not correct our alienation, but it's rather just going to perhaps further occlude it by an act of misdirection or something like that. In the next paragraph, he writes, but the essence of the human being consists in his being more than merely human. But he says this isn't an additive sense of more than human. He says the more means more originally and therefore more essentially in terms of his essence. And there something enigmatic manifests itself, the human being in his thrownness. This means that the human being, as the existing counterthrow of being, is more than a rational animal, precisely to the extent that he is less bound up with the human being conceived from subjectivity. The human being is not the lord of beings. The human being is the shepherd of beings. Getting back to that earlier passage in the text. Human beings lose nothing in this less. Rather, they gain, and that they attain the truth of being. They gain the essential poverty of the shepherd, whose dignity consists in being called by being into the preservation of being's truth. Heidegger is using the somewhat, the frugality and the simplicity of notions of the shepherd or the farmer. That, this imagery, this language is talking to a different type of poverty. There's a type of poverty when it comes to thinking that Heidegger is wanting to overcome. Like there's an impoverishment when we start thinking too rigidly in terms of like logic and ethics, physics. That there's an impoverishing element to that when it comes to an original type of thinking and philosophizing. But there's another type of poverty that has to do more with the frugality and the simplicity with which notions of the shepherd or the farmer, who's living with some degree of equilibrium, of being attentive to the seasons, to the task at hand, never sort of never venturing too far from where it is that they're at and what they're doing. It's not glorified. It's not dominating. It's not overly exacting. It's not overcorrecting. But it's rather for Heidegger a much more sort of honest and simple way of being. And so he's equating that kind of task to what should go into our relationship with language, our relationship to thinking, into how we're existing. Let's jump ahead. A couple of paragraphs. He talks a little bit more about being in time. He says, in Being in Time, it's said that every question of philosophy returns to existence, but existence here is not the actuality of the ego cogito, neither is it the actuality of subjects who act with and for each other and so become who they are. Existence, in the fundamental contrast to every extensia and existence, is ecstatic dwelling in the nearness of being. It is the guardianship that is the care of being. This idea of taking care for being by taking care of our own being, that this is really that the ecstatic dwelling in the nearness of being that we talked about, previously, that so much can be derived from simply taking care, of really paying heed, of being attentive to our own being. And this is how it is that we act as these shepherds or guardians of being. He says, the difficulty is not a matter of indulging in a special sort of profundity and of building complicated concepts. Again, the stuff that more contemporary philosophy or overly metaphysical or epistemologically oriented philosophy might want to do. He says, rather, it is concealed in the step back that lets thinking enter into a questioning that experiences and lets the habitual opining of philosophy fall away. So a lot of the sort of poorer practices of philosophy um, can sort of the unhelpful speculative, purely conjectural, um, way of doing philosophy can be overcome by simply returning to um, a way of thinking that lets lets the questions build the way, that lets that more. I'll use words like genuine and honest because I think that they're helpful. Like a genuine, honest attunement to where we're at and what we're doing and how we're existing. That can um, really unlock whatever's concealed in being, as opposed to more speculative um, projects that will like overleap that more fundamental comportment and task. If you drop down, skip a paragraph, he says, but it is also the case that the matter of thinking is not achieved in the fact that idle talk about the truth of being and the history of being is set in motion. Everything depends upon this alone, that the truth of being come to language, and that thinking attain to this language. Perhaps then language requires much less precipitate expression than proper silence. But who of us today would want to imagine that his attempts to think are at home on the path to silence? I mean, silence being a sort of necessary requisite for using or being used by language in the most efficacious way. I mean, that sometimes we just need to be quiet and meditative, and let language sort of speak when it needs to speak. And again, I'll reference the question concerning technology. Again, just as a very loose analogy, like the old windmill that really just sits there patiently waiting for the wind to blow, so then it can do what it is that it's sort of meant to do. And that's contrasted with more modern technologies in which it just goes and it takes from the earth. So sort of a view of language as dominating or attacking through speculative concept construction, as opposed to a quiet receptive posture that when the words come and when the questions come and where they take us, and that's sort of guiding our way into the truth of being. So if you drop down, he revisits that first question from Jean Bouffret. Skip a paragraph, and then he says, you ask, how can some sense be restored to the word humanism? Your question not only presupposes a desire to retain the word humanism, but also contains an admission that this word has lost its meaning. It has lost it through the insight that the essence of humanism is metaphysical, which now means that metaphysics not only does not pose the question concerning the truth of being, but also obstructs the question insofar as metaphysics persists in the oblivion of being. And then he carries that further to the end of the paragraph, where he writes, humanism now means, in case we decide to retain the word, that the essence of the human being is essential for the truth of being. So like if we were going to even use that term, and I don't think that Heidegger thinks that we necessarily need to, he says, the essence of the human being is essential for the truth of being, especially in such a way that what matters is not the human being simply as such. So we're thinking a curious kind of humanism, clearly. The word results in a name that is literally a grove where no light penetrates. I mean, something like if we were going to do humanism, we would kind of have to take all the humanism out of it. And it would have to be a return to being, to the ground of being, as it were. And then maybe we could get something, worth retrieving out of it if we did something like that. But to the degree that it remains metaphysical, and its presumptions and its projects like that. Let's just leave that behind. So drop down another paragraph, and we're going to get some somewhat more forceful statements by Heidegger. He says, because we're speaking against humanism, people fear a defense of the inhuman and a glorification of barbaric brutality. Clearly, that's not what Heidegger means. He says, for what is more logical than for somebody who negotiates humanism, nothing remains but the affirmation of inhumanity. I mean, because you get stuck in this sense of, once you're thinking in this way, then if you don't, and this is my simplification of it, then if you don't think that way, then you must be for, whatever seems, ostensibly the sort of counter principle or idea. Oh, so you're against humanism, so you must be for, the inhuman. Because we're speaking against logic, people believe we're demanding that the rigor of thinking be renounced, and in its place, the arbitrariness of drives and feelings be installed, and thus that irrationalism be proclaimed as true. And again, he says, what's more logical than whoever speaks against the logical defending the illogical. So again, that's not what he's saying, but it makes sense that, within how these people think that they would say this. Because we're speaking against values, people are horrified at philosophy that ostensibly dares to despise humanity's best qualities. Again, what's more logical than that? If you deny values, then everything must be valueless. Because we say that the being of the human being consists in being in the world, people find that the human being is downgraded to a merely terrestrial being, whereupon philosophy sinks into positivism. But what's more logical, than that? He goes on to say, because we refer to the word of Nietzsche on the death of God, people regard such a gesture atheism. Again, according to their logic, all right. Again, that's not what he's saying. Because in all the respects mentioned, we everywhere speak against all that humanity deems high and holy. Our philosophy teaches an irresponsible and destructive nihilism. What's more logical than whoever roundly denies that what is truly in being puts himself on the side of non-being and thus professes the pure nothing as the meaning of reality? And this, I think this is really helpful because he's really working through, like, in the most direct way, like, if we're sort of arguing against this, don't assume, like everyone else, that means that we're arguing for the opposite. It's too reductive. It's too still trapped in that type of logic. What's going on here? People here talk about humanism, logic, values, world, God. They hear something about opposition to these. They recognize and accept these as positive. But with hearsay, and in a way that's not strictly deliberate, they immediately assume that what speaks against something is automatically its negation, and that it's negative and in a sense destructive. And I mean, this goes on all the time, and even in less sophisticated versions of this today, in our, what passes for intellectual discourse, what passes for political discourse, positions on social issues, that the ability to take a truly philosophical perspective and to take issue with certain things, to explore the nuance and the ambiguity. People want things to be sort of brought into, like, a box, to be brought under a particular term, and if not this term, then this other term, right? And that's, for Heidegger, that's just it's not philosophical. Drop down a few lines. He says, we're so filled with logic that anything that disturbs the habitual somnolence of prevailing opinion is automatically registered as a despicable contradiction. We pitch everything that does not stay close to the familiar and beloved positive into the previously excavated pit of pure negation, which negates everything, ends in nothing, and so consummates nihilism. Following this logical course, we let everything expire in nihilism. In a nihilism we invented for ourselves with the aid of logic. I mean, It's a really nice, succinct, I know it maybe sounds a little dense, but it's a really nice, succinct statement that Heidegger's making here about how this type of thinking, this metaphysical thinking, this type of logic, that it actually results in a nihilism, which is um, the type of thinking that ends in the oblivion of being. Being is forgotten. Original thinking is forgotten. The original sort of journey, let's say, into the truth of being. Because because we can think and we can ask questions, because we can sort of go where the questions take us. And come to whatever sort of insights we might come to, whatever truths we might come to, because that's sort of excluded by these sort of restrictive areas or disciplines or methods or isms, that these don't lead to the type of progress that we assume that they do in thinking, in social affairs, or whatever. This results in a type of nihilism in which eventually no one's going to be thinking at all. No one's going to be asking real questions at all. So let's see. Skip a paragraph. I'll just run through a couple things here real quick. He says it ought to be somewhat clearer now that opposition to humanism in no way implies a defense of the inhuman, but rather opens up other vistas, other views, it's opening up the ability to sort of see things from a vantage otherwise restricted, from us. And then drop down another paragraph. To think against values is not to maintain that everything interpreted as a value, culture, art, science, human dignity, world, God, is valueless. Rather, it's important finally to realize that precisely through the characterization of something as a value, what is valued is robbed of its worth. I think that's a really nice line. That it's not thinking against values that robs things of its worth. It's thinking in terms of a value that actually doesn't let a thing be what it is. It doesn't allow an exploration into meaning and like real worth, but rather is going to be an act of projection onto that thing, strictly in terms of one's, own biases within the metaphysical context, within the context of these isms, and so the real worth or the real value is going to sort of be withheld from us. Let's see. A few lines down, he says, the bizarre effort to prove the objectivity of values does not know what it's doing. When one proclaims God the altogether highest value, this is a degradation of God's essence. Here as elsewhere, thinking in values the greatest blasphemy imaginable against being. He talks more about this, but I'm going to jump ahead. Go to the bottom of the next paragraph. He says, rather, before all this, the human being in his essence is existent. Into the openness of being, into the open region that first clears the between, within which a relation of subject to object can be. So this is getting back to the idea. And again, remember, there is repetition throughout, but it's like, Heidegger making a point, sort of slowly working through it, then returning to it. Hopefully the idea becomes more and more clear and apprehensible. And so here is that idea of into the openness of being, into the sort of clearing, in which case the usual subject-object relation, which is obviously problematic because when I assume the sort of Cartesian sense of the thinking subject that's somewhat sort of trapped in their own thinking, but perceives things strictly in terms of objects within this relationship. then really the subject isn't what the subject is, and objects really aren't whatever the objects are. But for Heidegger, we can perhaps actually have something like, I'll say, a genuine, ability of being a subject that can sort of think in terms of objects, like the original relationship between things, between phenomena, that we can get some sort of access to it, but not as long as we're trapped in the sort of metaphysical, overly epistemologically oriented, sense of those terms and relationships. So we have to get behind them. We got to get more original, so that we can once again return to the task of what it is that a thinker is doing and thinking about this phenomenon, thinking about this phenomenon. Let's see. Let's get to the second question from Bouffray. So go skip 1, 2, 3. Skip 3 paragraphs. And let's see. He writes, but if humanitas must be viewed as so essential to the thinking of being, must not ontology therefore be supplemented by ethics? And I think, I had mentioned that what had been lacking from being in time was an ethics. So this is, a question that always sort of comes up. And so the question from Bouffray is, what I have been trying to do for a long time now is to determine precisely the relation of ontology to a possible ethics. Heidegger is writing to this. He says, soon after being in time, appeared a young friend asked me, when are you going to write an ethics? And then drop down a few lines. He says, the desire for an ethics presses ever more ardently for fulfillment, as the obvious, no less than the hidden perplexity of human beings soars to immeasurable heights. The greatest care must be fostered upon the ethical bond at a time when technological human beings, delivered over to mass society, and you can start to hear a lot of stuff that we've been reading this semester. We've been reading Marx. We've read Sartre. This idea that there's this problem, and there's a whole host of problems associated with modernity that would seem to be where ethics is becoming ever more like a pressing thing. What are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to sort of act or behave, especially as industrialization, mass society, the technological rationality, all these things are making life so much more alienated, so much more complex. Heidegger says, he says, when technological human beings delivered over to mass society can attain reliable constancy only by gathering and ordering all their plans and activities in a way that corresponds to technology. So it really has to take that into account. Let's see, he says, skip a paragraph. He says, before we attempt to determine more precisely the relationship between ontology and ethics, being, for Heidegger, the fundamental philosophy, and ethics, what it is that we should, do, how should we act? We must ask what ontology and ethics themselves are. It becomes necessary to ponder whether we can be designated by both terms. Still remains near and proper to what is assigned to thinking, which as such has to think above all the truth of being. So Heidegger, doing what he's been doing, it's like we use these terms, but can we clarify these terms? What do we mean by these terms? If we say that there's an ethics, and he's conceding, look, at the time that we live in makes sense. I can understand why you want to know, what how do we get at an ethics? and what's its relationship to this existential phenomenology, which is all about ontology. Um, it makes sense, especially in the technological age, especially now, modernity. Um, and what does he do? I mean, he goes back to the ancients. He goes back to Plato. He goes back to Sophocles. He says, if you drop down a little bit, he says thinkers prior to this period knew neither a logic nor an ethics nor physics. Yet their thinking was never illogical nor immoral. Like if we go back far enough, they weren't even making these distinctions, and yet they seem to be speaking truth. They seem to be speaking with profound insight. Is that something that's still a possibility for us? Can we go behind the sort of metaphysical tradition or traditions to get back to this original, before things started to sort of branch off and occlude and forget being itself? He says, but they did think physis in a depth and breadth, being physis, in a depth and breadth that no subsequent physics was ever able to. Again, the tragedies of Sophocles provided such a comparison is it all permissible. Preserve the ethos in their sayings more primordially than Aristotle's lectures on ethics, right? Like I'm going to put it in these terms. It's almost like when Sophocles is showing us ethos, that's like more ethical than Aristotle talking about ethics, right? Heidegger's saying. A saying of Heraclitus that consists only of 3 words says something so simply that from it the essence of ethos immediately comes to light. The saying of Heraclitus, fragment 110, 119. He says, goes, ethos anthropo daemon. This is usually translated, a man's character is his daemon. This translation thinks in a modern way, not a Greek one. So he's problematizing the usual way that it's translated. And so Heidegger, of course, is going to do what he often does, and that's sort of offer a more hermeneutically attuned phenomenological interpretation. So that he thinks that like if you really pay attention to it and know what's going on there, you can sort of unpack it with a better translation. He says, this translation thinks in a modern way, not a Greek one. Ethos means abode or dwelling place. The word names the open region in which the human being dwells. The open region of this abode allows what pertains to the essence of the human being and what in thus arriving resides in nearness to him to appear. The abode of the human being contains and preserves the advent of what belongs to the human being in his essence. According to Heraclitus' phrase, this is daemon, the god. The fragment says, the human being dwells insofar as he is a human being in the nearness of God. Right? Very different translation. But it's something like where it is we dwell and in the way that we dwell, that's nearness to the gods, right? That there's something important in what we would otherwise think of as not important and everyday and ordinary. He says, he recalls a story. The story is told of something Heraclitus said to some strangers who wanted to come visit him. Having arrived, they saw him warming himself at a stove. He says, surprised, they stood there in consternation, above all because he encouraged them, the astounded ones, and called to them to come in with words, for here too the gods are present. let me drop down a little bit after that. He says, instead of this, the sightseers find Heraclitus by a like they're going. These visitors are coming to find Heraclitus. He's wise. He's like well known, and then they're gonna find him. They're gonna you know have an important conversation. They're gonna see this person who has these amazing insights and truths, and they find a human being who's warming themselves next to the stove, just like an ordinary person, and Heraclitus is saying the gods are here too. Wisdom is here too in this place. He says, instead of this, the sightseers find Heraclitus by a stove. This is surely a common and insignificant place, but it's not. That's the point. He says, let's see, the vision of a shivering thinker offers little of interest. At this disappointing spectacle, even the curious can lose the desire to come any closer. What are they supposed to do there? Such an everyday and unexciting occurrence. Someone who's chilled warming himself by the stove. Anyone can find any time at home, right? Themselves, anyone else. He says, Heraclitus reads the frustrated curiosity in their faces. He knows that for the crowd, the failure of an unexpected sensation to materialize is enough to make those who have just arrived leave. He therefore encourages them. He invites them to explicitly to come in with the words, here too the gods come to presence. And drop down a little bit, he talks about his translation of ethos as abode, the abode of the thinker, and his deed in another light. He says, even here at the stove, in that ordinary place, where everything and every circumstance, each deed and thought is intimate and commonplace, that is familiar, even there, in the sphere of the familiar, it is the case that the gods come to presence. I mean, part of the reason that, or largely I think the reason that Heidegger is doing this is because a lot of what he seems to be doing seems to be, avoiding the sophistication and this expectation that one would have when one starts talking about logic or ethics or physics, when one starts to think about any of the isms, when one starts to think about, particular facets of metaphysics, that there's such a simplicity and yet a profundity, a genuine profundity in what he's trying to espouse, that nearness to being is like it's already happening, like we're already where being's happening. But the truth of being is in the comportment to where it is that we're at, like that we are where we are, and we're doing whatever it is that we're doing. And the way that we like tune ourselves to that is what it is that sort of activates the presence of the gods, of the divine. And if that language is a little too heavy-handed for you, I mean, it's the sense of whatever it is that being can disclose to you through thinking, through language, is something that merely takes turning yourself over to it, right where you're at and right where you're doing. It doesn't have to be in a special place. It doesn't have to be in a special time. It doesn't have to be in a philosophy class. It doesn't have to be, found in one type of book. That it can really just sort of be a very sort of ordinary place and time. Let's see. Let me try to get through this. There's just a little bit left. Heraclitus says, the familiar abode for humans is the open region for the presencing of God, the unfamiliar one. That's, I think, Heidegger's sort of like formal retranslation of it. And so Heidegger goes on here to say, and this is really important, he says, if the name ethics, in keeping with the basic meaning of the word ethos, should now say that ethics ponders the abode of the human being, then that thinking which thinks the truth of being as the primordial element of the human being, as one who exists, is in itself originary ethics. However, this thinking is not ethics in the first sense because it's ontology. I basically want to say that ethics, in the sense that it's usually conceived of for Heidegger, misses the mark and it's unhelpful. But as he has said, a few pages back, that doesn't mean that he's interested in monstrous behavior, barbarism, immorality, irrationality. He's interested in an originary ethics, and originary ethics is basically ontology. It's basically here we are, in being, and that the abode, the place and the manner in which we find ourselves being discloses everything that we basically need to be ethical. And that might be difficult for a lot of people. I think that they're like, no, like we need some like rules. We need some like, give us some imperatives. Give us something. And I think that for Heidegger, that all kind of that stuff is all manufacturing something to fail. That we're here in being with others. That taking proper care of where and when and how we are with others, where we're at, doing what we're doing, that's all the stuff that we need to really know what it means to be ethical in an original sense. And it's not that it comes without dangers or without complications, but we end up manufacturing more for ourselves if we get away from that frugality and that simplicity and that originality. Okay. There's some other really great stuff, but clearly I want to try and save some time. Talks about theory and practice and dwelling poetically, stuff that I really love, but just to get through this, let's get to the third question. So if you'll jump ahead a few paragraphs, he says, here the third question of your letter must be entertained. How can we preserve the element of adventure that all research contains without simply turning philosophy into an adventurous? I shall mention poetry now only in passing. It is confronted by the same question and in the same manner as thinking. But Aristotle's words and the Poetics, although they've scarcely been pondered, are still valid. That poetizing is truer than the exploration of beings. But thinking is an adventure, not only as a search and an inquiry into the unthought. Thinking in its essence as thinking of being is claimed by being. Thinking is related to being in what arrives. Thinking as such is bound to the advent of being. To being is advent. Being has already been destined to thinking. Being is as the destiny of thinking. I'll just repeat it. Being is as the destiny of thinking. But destiny is in itself historical. Its history has already come to language in the saying of thinkers. Let me read a little bit more and then I'll make some comments. If you jump ahead a little bit, he says, it is equally essential to ponder whether what is to be thought is to be said. To what extent, at what moments of the history of being, and what sort of dialogue with this history, and on the basis of what claim it ought to be said. The threefold issue mentioned in an earlier letter is determined in its cohesion by the law of the fittingness of thought on the history of being. Rigor of meditation, carefulness in saying, frugality with words. It's time to break the habit of overestimating philosophy and thereby asking too much of it. What is needed in the present world crisis is less philosophy, but much more attentiveness in thinking, less literature, more cultivation of the letter. And then he ends on some thinking that gets back to that pastoral simplicity of some like farming language. And so what I want to say is with this third question, again from Bouffret, this idea of preserving the element of adventure, but without philosophy becoming, something that's, I don't know, too whimsical or too based off of, curious flights of fancy, perhaps. For Heidegger, thinking and being go hand in hand. This is going back to the comments on language, the comments on thinking, throughout the work. The destiny of being is the destiny of thinking. That it sort of rests with us to take it up, to be ones who think, not ones who merely calculate, not ones who merely find solutions to problems, usually problems that we just sort of invented, either for theory's sake or because of what we've done socially or politically or what have you. He says, I'll pay a little bit more attention to those last few lines. The threefold issue mentioned in an earlier letter is determined in its cohesion by the law of the fittingness of thought on the history of being. Rigor of meditation, carefulness in saying, frugality with words. I mean, this is really breaking down what I think is Heidegger wants us to get out of this. And then he says, it's time to break the habit of overestimating philosophy. Like, we perhaps, as a result of the long history of philosophy and of the various grandiose projects of philosophy and the systematic philosophies and the philosophical tomes and everything that it's sort of come together. And look, I mean, some of that's amazing. Some of and much of it's Heidegger read it and taught it. But it's not a cure-all, and it's certainly not something that's meant to account for every single thing. Philosophy is about wonderment. It's the love of wisdom. It's based in Dasein. It's based in awe before being, and Heidegger takes that, I think, very seriously, and that's what we sort of really need to attempt to go back to. What's needed in the present world crisis is less philosophy, but more attentiveness and thinking, which we've talked about. Less literature, but more cultivation of the letter. We talked a little bit about silence, I think, which is relevant here. We don't need to worry about producing so much. What we need to do is, really bring forward what it is that's useful. Good questions, thoughtful responses, meditations on things, letting things be what they are so that we understand our relationship to them, so that we understand what they are. The biggest takeaway for me for this text is that it not only sort of gives us a once-over of the major themes and concerns of Heidegger's philosophy, but, of the three questions, for me, the biggest one is probably ethics, and that is that ethics is for Heidegger, in an original sense, part and parcel to ontology, and it's, paying attention and asking the question of the meaning of being and letting things sort of be what they are, and so that the truth of being can be known even where we are. And that means that, in this sense, that we would be able to act ethically. If we view it as some sort of separate task, and it comes with this set of rules and procedures, that it just won't work. It'll always sort of fail. And as I said before, it's not as though what Heidegger is offering here doesn't still have plenty of ambiguities to work through and plenty of dangers, but nevertheless, in an original sense, in an authentic sense, it gives us the best shot at being genuinely ethical as thinking, questioning beings. So there's a lot that we probably didn't get into, and maybe some things that could have been stated differently. But I hope that this was helpful in at least getting some of the main ideas of this piece together for you, explicated, adequately, and an overall sense of what's going on. So we're almost done with the semester. We'll come back with a couple more readings, but until then, keep reading, keep thinking.